Our topic this evening is Contradictions in the Passion Stories. This is part of our Easter series. This is the first part. And so what we're going to look at is the ways, especially the four canonical Gospels, tell the story leading up to Jesus Christ, or Jesus's crucifixion. And then in the next part that we'll do next Tuesday, we will look at the crucifixion stories themselves and the Easter stories, the resurrection stories. The very earliest account of the Passion stories doesn't come from the Gospels, comes, as is normal, from Paul, who is, of course, the first Christian whose writings survive. And so we read in his letter to the Corinthians, his first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 15, this very often quoted passage where Paul says, I handed on to you, this community that he has planted, as of first importance what I in turn had received. So this is something that he didn't formulate, but this is something that is central to his understanding of what it means to be Christian, as the emerging group is going to be known. That Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures. And so that's the component of the living Jesus of Nazareth. But then after his death, that he appeared to Cephas, that is to say Peter, and then to the 12. And then he appeared to more than 500 brothers and sisters at one time, most of whom are still alive at the time Paul was writing this letter, though some have died, he admits. Then he appeared to James, Jesus' brother, then to all the apostles, who Paul understands to be a much larger group of missionaries than simply the 12. Last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me, Paul says. So, although, as you can kind of see in that, Paul is much more concerned with appearances of the risen Christ to the 12, to all of these women and male disciples, apostles, and also other figures, his narrative does include the idea that Christ died for our sins, was buried, and was raised on the third day, and that this was all in accordance with what the Scriptures had said. That is to say, as he is reading the Hebrew Bible, translated into Greek, the Septuagint, which is now becoming the Christian Old Testament, that is predicting his understanding of what the Messiah is, what the Christ is, and Jesus' life and resurrection is therefore in accord with that. So in addition to that, really important kind of very early version of the Passion, in that same letter to the Corinthians, Paul gives details about what we call the Last Supper and also about Jesus' betrayal. And so he says, I received from the Lord what I also handed on to you. And that same kind of formula. This is an important thing, is what he's saying. That the Lord Jesus, on the night when he was betrayed, took a loaf of bread, and when he'd given thanks, he broke it and said, this is my body that is for you. Do this in remembrance of me. And in the same way, he took the cup also after supper, saying, this cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me. So that last part is already becoming a spiritual practice sacramental formula. And we're seeing in that the kind of prototype of what's going to be the Christian sacrament of communion or Eucharist or the Lord's Supper. And so Paul is aware of that tradition being associated with the night that Jesus was betrayed or when Jesus was handed over. Paul also cites crucifixion as the method of Jesus' execution in multiple places. And in that same letter to the Corinthians, he indicates that those responsible for the crucifixion were the, quote, rulers of this age. So Paul says, we speak God's wisdom, a hidden mystery, which God decreed before the ages for our glory, and which none of the rulers of this age understood. So this hidden mystery, this Christ that has existed before all of the ages, it is something that we are testifying of, but which none of the rulers of this age understood, for if they had, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. So the rulers of this age crucified the Lord, who is Christ, who is Jesus. So all of these statements that Paul is making accord with the little we can know about the historical Jesus' execution from non-Christian sources. And so in the Roman historian Tacitus, who wrote a book of annals at the very beginning of the 2nd century, who is actually very negatively disposed towards Christianity. He calls it a most mischievous superstition. Tacitus likewise confirms that Christus, as he calls him, from whom the name of the religion has its origin, Christus suffered the extreme penalty, that is, he was executed during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilatus. So this confirms that the Romans were responsible for the execution. The official in charge was Pontius Pilate. And although Tacitus here calls him a procurator, this is because contemporary Judea is run by procurators. At the time of Pilate, it was actually prefects. In any event, it's a similar thing. So he's a prefect. In the portion of his account of Jesus that most scholars today accept as authentic, the Jewish Roman historian Josephus gives us similar information in his Jewish Antiquities book. So he says, "And when, upon the accusation of the principal men among us," that is to say, Jewish authorities in Jerusalem, when they accused him, Pilate had him, Jesus, condemned to a cross. And those who had first come to love him did not cease. So even though Pilate crucified the founder of this movement, Jesus, the movement didn't end with him. So the movement didn't cease. So again, this confirms that Pilate is the official in charge of the execution. The standard Roman method of execution is employed, crucifixion, but this adds the detail that certain Jewish authorities brought the accusation. So there's something going on in the politics, local politics, and both leaders, the locals and also the Roman authorities, were ready to get rid of this guy. So this much at least is historical. So we have the idea that Jesus of Nazareth, the historical Jesus, traveled from Galilee, where he was from and where the bulk of his career had been lived, to Jerusalem, where he's then betrayed by one of his own disciples to Roman authorities under the command of the prefect, Pontius Pilate, and Pilate is probably acting with support of a faction of the local leaders. Pilate, pretty confirmed as a historical figure. We actually have a contemporary inscription that he had erected in the provincial capital, Caesarea Maritimea, so the Caesarea, the city on the Mediterranean, that bears Pilate's name. And Pilate then had Jesus executed by crucifixion. So if we do a little bit of a timeline to ground ourselves, Jesus' ministry then is at the very end of the 20s, and he's probably crucified around 30, sometimes stated to 33. The proto-Christian communities continue on, so they wouldn't have been called Christian at first. The central community in Jerusalem is led by Jesus' brother James, and we've called it before the poor of Jerusalem. Maybe around 35, Paul converts and starts to be a sort of self-appointed or an appointed apostle by vision. And in the course of that, as he's establishing Christian communities, beginning in the 50s, he starts writing these letters, which are the earliest Christian sources that survive. Possibly then in that same time is when some of the other Christian writings that don't survive are composed, and that could include the source that scholars call Q, the Sayings Gospel, and also potentially a Signs Gospel, which would be a source or the earliest component of the Gospel of John. Maybe also an early source, Sayings source for the Gospel of Thomas, and also in here maybe an early Passion source that is a source for both Mark and John and some of the other early Gospels. By the time we get to 66 to 73 is the Roman-Jewish War that includes the destruction of Jerusalem, the ending of the community there, the Christian community there that has to flee to a town called Pella. And that is the context in which the author of Mark is writing the first narrative gospel and the first gospel that survives. And then from there, then the next Gospels that made it into the canon, Matthew, Luke, and John. So that grounds us. So there are significantly more detail about the Passion stories given in the 4 canonical Gospels than that little bit that we can glean out of Paul. And so this may include additional events that have historicity. Each of these early Christian communities that produce the Gospels have an oral tradition that's coming down to them. But they also undoubtedly include details that are literary, in other words, that don't go back to the historical Jesus. And while all 4 versions are broadly similar, each Gospel differs in specific details. And this is because the Gospel writers are not historians and they're not seeking to create a biography or a history, but rather they have a religious portrait where they're attempting to have the idea of proclaiming Jesus as the Messiah, proving that to readers so that people will become one in this new movement in the body of Christ. So the Passion stories are very, very important to that end in each of the Gospels. And so in all the narrative Gospels, the canonical Gospels, just this final 1 week in Jesus' life actually takes up a significant component of the writing. So about 20% of Mark and Luke is devoted to the last week, 15% of Matthew, and a fully 40% of the Gospel of John or is all devoted to this 1 week. Normally, as we do these kind of gospel studies, we expect that the accounts in Mark, Matthew, and Luke are going to be very, very similar, and the Gospel of John is going to be kind of an odd man out, which tells the story very differently, and that's because Mark is a source for Matthew and Luke. The authors of Matthew and Luke are having the text of Mark right in front of them as they are writing their Gospels. Specifically, Luke says that they are critical of people who've tried to tell this story before, and so Luke doesn't particularly like the way that Mark has told the Gospel and is correcting or changing things that Luke reads in Mark's text, and is in some cases deleting a bunch of it. Matthew is doing something similar, although the author of Matthew doesn't say so explicitly the way Luke does. And we can also tell that the author of Matthew is far less likely to delete things, although he will also make corrections. So normally, though, the Gospel of John has a completely different literary tradition. It's not literarily dependent on either of the 3. So the author of John does not have a copy of one of these 3 or all of these 3 Gospels in front of them, but instead is drawing from some of the same sources in the sense of there's an oral tradition, and there is also one more written tradition that they all do have access to. But the Passion narrative is strange. So when we were just talking about this last week, the Gospel of John now suddenly shares an unusual amount of really specific details and even phrases and characters and so on with the other three Gospels. And so this sudden alignment that the Gospels have, that the fourth Gospel has with the other three, has long suggested to scholars that there's maybe some additional relationship to the two traditions for at least this section of the story. And so there's a couple possibilities, which is maybe the authors of John were actually aware of Mark, or maybe at least the Passion section of Mark. So maybe that might be something like where the author of John has been to a community where Mark is being read, and they've heard it read, they remember what's being said, and they come back, they don't have a copy of it, and are reacting to it, or are making use of it in some way. So that's possible, so something indirect like that. If so, then John is maybe trying to fix Mark the way the other two authors is, at least about this portion, the Passion portion. Another possibility that a lot of scholars have floated is that there is this pre-Markan source, so something that the author of Mark is making use of, a lost Passion gospel that would be pretty bare bones and simple, that doesn't exist anymore, but that same Passion source is being used then by the author of Mark, is also being used by the authors of John. There's maybe a source that is underlying other fragments that we have, like the Gospel of Peter, which doesn't make it into the canon, but some scholars like John Dominic Crossan says may be dependent on this lost Passion gospel source. That said, whereas the other source for the synoptics, the lost and then hypothetical gospel Q, the saying source, whereas that, I think, is the scholarly consensus that describes most conclusively how it's possible the relationship between Matthew, Luke, and Mark could possibly work. This idea of a lost Passion gospel isn't anywhere near as clear cut, and it's because it's harder to see like a very direct literary seams. So you can see in Matthew and Luke, they have all of these sayings of Jesus that are very, very similar to each other that are not in Mark, and so they've got to have taken them from somewhere. In the Passion source here, we would have a lot of details that are very compelling, that how similar they are, but it isn't clear that they have directly copied from something, that they're literally dependent on each other. So, of course, there's other traditions, again, that the Gospels are preserving, non-witness accounts. So each one of these is also being produced by an early Christian community. That community has its own traditions. They're not eyewitnesses, but they have known eyewitnesses maybe. And in any event, another thing that has happened is, though, that they have also grown out of a tradition of Christian apostles, Christian prophets walking around and speaking in the Spirit, and in a lot of cases speaking in the Spirit about the risen Christ. And so they also may not be able to tell within their own tradition what is supposed to have gone back to the historical Jesus and what maybe is a vision of a Christian apostle speaking in the Spirit. Nevertheless, some of the things that are included within the, let's say, special Matthewan tradition or Lucan tradition or Johannine tradition may include memories of the historical Jesus. But one thing that we can tell is that all of these evangelists are using another written source, the Septuagint, so the scriptures like Paul was talking about. So because each one of these early Christians believed, like Paul testified, that Jesus' life was lived in accordance with the scriptures, whenever they were writing something about, they're trying to write out what Jesus' life was like, and they don't have any memory of that time period, they don't have any memory of those details, well, they could just go back to the Septuagint, they can just go back to the Old Testament and find some kind of a quotation certainly messianic prophecies, but in a lot of cases just quotations in general, and say, well, because Jesus' life was lived according to the Scriptures, and this is in the Scriptures, this is something that he must have done. And so they would directly bring things from the Old Testament and rework it as something in Jesus' life. So we can see that happening in the Passion stories in a lot of places. And I can just list here some of the most obvious one. So the Psalms, the book of Psalms, includes kind of there's a collection of poems. It includes an abstract figure that scholars call the innocent sufferer. So as you're kind of saying this words, the speaker is embodying the innocent sufferer. And early Christians identified the innocent sufferer as prefiguring Christ, typologically. So this is a way that God is communicating and talking about universal truths. This ancient source is talking about what would then be lived in Christ. And so in Psalm 22, which is a lament of this innocent sufferer, he mourns, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And so this provides the direct literary source for Jesus' last words as given in the Gospel of Mark. So in Mark chapter 13, verse 34, we read, "At 3:00, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, 'Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani,' which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" So that same innocent sufferer in the Psalms provides additional details for how Jesus is treated on the cross. So we read in the Psalms, "They gave me poison for food, and for my thirst they gave me vinegar to drink." And so that detail taken from the Psalms is added into Mark's account of the crucifixion of Jesus, where we read, "Someone ran, they filled a sponge with sour wine, they put it on a stick and gave it to him to drink." Another example is the soldiers wagering over the division of Jesus' clothing in Mark. They crucified him and they divided his clothes among them, casting lots to decide what each should take. So that's Jesus' clothes are being divided by the soldiers. And that again is drawn directly from Psalm 22, where it says, where the innocent sufferer says, "They divided my clothes among themselves, and for my clothing they cast lots." So the Septuagint, the Old Testament, is a source that is available to the authors of Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John, and sometimes they access it indirectly. So Matthew and Luke can access it indirectly by the fact that Mark has built from it first. So that said, because many readers, Christians both in antiquity and today, they assume that the Gospels are historically accurate. In antiquity, they assumed that this sort of thing, that it happened. In modern times, we have a brand new and very specific idea of historicity that wasn't available to the ancients because they didn't have our modern understanding of academic history. Nevertheless, many readers read it as if it's something that is all history. Christians then tend to conflate all four accounts together. So, in other words, they may be recognizing that these aren't all the same account, and yet since it's all describing one thing that just happened, the way to make sense of it is to simply lump it all together. And therefore, essentially, all of the different details are not seen as contradictions, but rather are lumped together as missing in the others. But this misunderstands what the evangelists are trying to do and the portraits the evangelists individually are trying to paint. So for example, since we know that the author of Luke is using Mark as a source, when there is a detail in Mark, when there's a mark in detail and Luke deliberately deletes that, again, that's a deliberate omission because Luke is saying, is seeing that and saying, okay, well, I don't want to have that. That doesn't fit my understanding of Jesus. That's not part of the portrait I'm trying to paint. And so if we then clump it back in and just make a big salad of all of the Gospels, we're missing the portrait that Luke is trying to paint, and so on. By lumping them all together, you're missing the individual portraits. So in all 4 canonical accounts of the Passion story, as I say, Jesus and his disciples have come from Galilee, so they're from up there, this northern region, which has a very mixed population. So there's Greeks and Jews. It's not all, and it's also not ruled directly by the Romans the way Judea is. So Judea, the province that includes Samaria and Idumea, centered on Jerusalem and Caesarea, that's what's ruled by Pontius Pilate. Galilee and Perea are under one of the Herodians, a tetrarch, as is another region up there, Iturea and Galantis. And all of this orange area here, Gilead and Phoenicia and Gaza, are directly part of the Roman province of Syria. So it's all Roman, but it's administered differently. Anyway, so Jesus and his followers who are from Galilee have come down to Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover festival. But then the details in all the 4 accounts, differ, including the chronology. They encounter opposition from Roman and Jewish authorities in the city, who are able to arrest Jesus with the help of one of his own disciples, so a traitor, and then those authorities have a trial and execute him in all 4 passion narratives. So in Mark, the earliest of these narrative gospels to survive, the events of the last week of Jesus' life kick off as Jesus and his disciples are approaching Jerusalem on their trip. They arrive at the villages of Bethphage and Bethany, and so these are little villages that are immediately east of Jerusalem. And he instructs his disciples to find a colt, which he then rides into Jerusalem. And on hearing of his arrival, this vast crowd gathers, and they lay down their cloaks in front of his path and also leafy branches in this huge celebration. They're also excited that he has arrived in the city. The crowd shouts hosannas, recognizing Jesus as the Messiah, but with variations in each gospel. I think this is interesting, the way each one of these is recorded. So in Mark, what the crowd says is, Hosanna, blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the coming kingdom of our ancestor David. So David is the model of the kingship, but the crowd here isn't shouting that Jesus is the king, blessed is the king in this particular case. It's one coming in the name of the Lord, coming into the kingdom of our ancestor David. In Matthew, though, the crowd shouts, Hosanna to the Son of David. And so Son of David is a phrase that essentially means to the Messiah, to the prince, the person who should be the heir to the king. Hosanna to the Son of David, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna in the highest heaven. In Luke, we have, blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord. Peace in heaven. Luke is very interested in Jesus as the Prince of Peace. This is another thing that the angels declare when his birth in the Lucan story. And glory in the highest heaven. That also reminds you a little bit about the angels are singing in the Lucan Christmas story. And in John, what the crowd says is, Hosanna, blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord, the King of Israel. So these later 2 Gospels are making the claim that the crowd are actually shouting out the King. It's only in Luke that Pharisees in the crowd who are really nervous about this spectacle, who say essentially, all of these people are calling you king. They yell to Jesus, Teacher, order your disciples to stop. To which Jesus answers, if these were silent, the stones would shout out. So that is Luke's detail. Although Mark does not say so explicitly, the crowd here is reacting to fulfillment of a messianic poem. So it's not just early Christians who are among the sects of Judaism that are awaiting a Messiah. Apocalypticism has become extremely popular, and many are waiting for a Messiah, and they read through the Hebrew scriptures in order to find them. So in Zechariah chapter 9, there is a poem where it says, "Rejoice greatly, O daughter Zion. Shout aloud, O daughter Jerusalem. See, your king comes to you. Triumphant and victorious is he, humble and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey." So even though that's a messianic prophecy that Mark is aware of, which is why Jesus was riding on a donkey, and his king is, and people recognize him as a king entering Jerusalem, Mark doesn't actually explicitly quote that scripture, nor does Luke in Luke's repetition of Mark's story. John, however, is aware of the prophecy, which he quotes, though presumably from memory, since he misquotes it. So he says, "Do not be afraid, daughter of Zion. Look, your king is coming, sitting on a donkey's colt." So it's kind of a reworking of the prophecy, not a direct quote. And this is not unusual at all in antiquity, because people tended to take scripture and they memorized it a lot more. There was a lot more memorization. People had less access to the books. They had fewer books, and memorization was more part of learning. And this is something that we have the author of Mark constantly doing too. Mark frequently misquotes from the Septuagint, because we can tell therefore that Mark doesn't have the scrolls in front of him as he's quoting, or having Jesus quote the New Testament in creating the Old Testament in creating his teachings. And so then often, because Matthew, the authors of Matthew and the author of Luke, know the scriptures better, they will silently correct the quotes that Mark is sort of making from memory, kind of misquoting. Matthew also quotes the Septuagint of Zechariah. He does it actually properly, so Matthew probably has access to the scrolls. But the Septuagint has actually mistranslated the original Hebrew to read. So the original Hebrew had said, "riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey." And so this is just part of normal Hebrew poetry repetition. But in the Septuagint, it becomes "riding on a donkey and on a colt, the foal of a donkey," as if there's two different animals here. And so this causes Matthew to have, in Matthew's version of the story, Jesus riding on both a donkey and also with her colt by her. And so that is where we get all of these pictures where Jesus has two animals. So this comes from, anyway, a misreading and misinterpretation of the Hebrew poetry in Zechariah's prophecy. So in the Gospel of Mark, this Palm Sunday episode, is followed the next day by Jesus entering the temple, which is a vast platform. It has a market and everything. It's not just the little temple. He doesn't actually get to go into the Holy of Holies or anything like that. This is the outer portions of the temple where there's a marketplace, where he overturns the tables of the money changers and also those selling doves to be sacrificed. So Matthew and Luke follow Mark's narrative, but in John has the story and knows the story, but it's not part of the Passion. The authors of John have taken it and relocated the story to the very beginning of the gospel, immediately after the story of the wedding at Cana, the story where Jesus turns water into wine. It's a story that exists only in John. It's the first of the signs, potentially of the sign gospel as a source of John, but in any event, it's the beginning of the ministry in John. And so, unlike the synoptics, the Gospel of John has Jesus going to Jerusalem multiple times in order to insert, for example, this story very early in his ministry, as opposed to where it is in Matthew, Luke, and Mark. In the synoptics, Jesus' actions in the temple are cited as contributing to the decision by Jerusalem authorities to seek to rid themselves of him. So we read in Mark 11 18. When the chief priests and scribes heard it, when they heard that he'd done all of this overturning of the money changers' tables, they kept looking for a way to kill him, for they were afraid of him because the whole crowd was spellbound by his teaching. So this guy has become really popular. They just saw how popular he was when this triumphal entry happened. And so they want to get rid of him, but they want to kill him, but they want to be able to do it in secret. So according to the synoptics, a second provocation is Jesus teaching a parable, the parable of the wicked tenants, which essentially describes how there's a lord who has property and the tenants are refusing to pay their due for being there, and he sends different officials, and ultimately he sends his son, and they all kill him. So then in different versions, there are different versions of it, but in some of the versions, then the Lord comes and expels the wicked tenants and replaces them. And so Jewish leaders interpret this as being against them. So their understanding of right religion is going to be gotten rid of, and there's going to be a new sect in town. By the time we're getting to the way the Gospels are written, Christianity, it will displace them. And so that also is cited as a second provocation that leads the leaders to want to get rid of Jesus. So neither of those is the reasoning or the motivation provided in John, because there are no parables in John. Jesus doesn't teach it. This is, again, an example of how different the fourth gospel is from the other three. And also, like I say, since that incident with the money changers has been changed in the chronology and is being put now at the very beginning of Jesus' ministry, they need to have something else to set them off. And so Jewish authorities are given very different motivations for opposing Jesus in the fourth gospel. So in John chapter 11, after Jesus performs this great sign that he's the Messiah of raising his friend Lazarus from the dead, a story, by the way, that is, again, only in John, we then read that the chief priests and Pharisees called a meeting of the council, and they said, "What are we to do? This man is performing many signs. If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him, and the Romans will come and destroy both our holy place, our temple, and our nation." But one of them, Caiaphas, who was high priest that year, said to them, "You know nothing at all. You do not understand that it is better for you to have one man die for the people than to have the whole nation destroyed." Okay, and so let's, I guess, unpack this. This is written, the gospel is written in decades after, as we saw, the Romans have destroyed Jerusalem and its temple, and the people, the locals in Judea, have also been rounded up. So many have been killed or sold into slavery and so on. And this may reflect kind of a Christian response to complaints or arguments that non-Christian Jews have made in the 80s and 90s, that devastation maybe happened. It was because you Christians have been impious. You have started saying that Jesus is the Messiah and that he is God and things like that, and that's why we've had to kick you out of the synagogues. All of this impiety you've had is caused this whole destruction, this devastation that we've all felt. And so this may be a Christian apologetic kind of answer to that, as this complaint is retrojected back into the lifetime of Jesus. So it's one possibility. So there are other motivations as well in the Gospel of John. So, of course, Christians understand Jesus to be the Messiah, that is to say, the Anointed One. I mean, that's a title that is given to both the priests, the high priests, but also the lost kings, the lost Davidic line in Judea and Jerusalem. And Messiah is just translated into Greek as Christ, or it's our English version of the Greek version of our English version of the Hebrew Messiah. So So Jesus is understood that way in all four Gospels. But each of them tell what that means in different ways. So in the Gospel of Mark, throughout most of the whole Gospel, Jesus teaches this truth in secret, and he always instructs his disciples not to talk about it. So he'll perform some incredible miracle, and then he tells everybody, don't tell anybody about this. Or one of his disciples will shout the testimony, you are the Christ, you are the Messiah, and he'll say, you're right, but you're not supposed to talk about this now. And so it's called the Messianic secret, it's often been called about in the Gospel of Mark. So it's an interesting position that Mark has. By contrast, in John, Jesus, from the very first verse, very openly declares his divinity. Jesus, as described in the Gospel of John, is the Logos, the God's Word. He's with God in the beginning. He is God. Not the Father, but divine somehow. And so Jesus then, throughout the text, frequently connects himself with God with the formulation. He continuously will say things where he says, I am. And I am is the name of God revealed to Moses at the burning bush in the book of Exodus. So in John alone, Jesus continually quotes Yahweh's words to Moses, I am that I am, which is a pun in Hebrew on the name Yahweh. It's not probably the real origin of the name Yahweh or Jehovah, but it's the biblically given folk etymology. And so there are the great I am sayings as the main teachings in the Gospel of John. There's not parables, but they are, I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world. I am the door. I am the good shepherd. I am the resurrection and the life. I am the way, the truth, and the life. I am the true vine. And he says I am a lot more times than just when he's making these big I am statements. So for anybody who is not God, in Second Temple Judaism, these I am statements, equating yourself with Yahweh speaking to Moses, that's blasphemy. And it would be providing, therefore, explicit motivation for the opposition of Jewish authorities in the Gospel of John. So just as the Johannine Christian community has testified that Christ is the Messiah and is the Son of God, is divine in these special ways, and that has caused them to be in schism with other non-Christian Jews and caused them to be expelled ultimately from the synagogues for continually preaching that and bugging everybody about that when everybody else doesn't believe that. So too, the authors of John have retrojected those claims, put them into the mouth of Jesus in this gospel. And so, for example, in John 8, Jesus is talking to a crowd of Jews. Jesus, of course, the historical Jesus is a Jew, but now the people in the Johannine community, the community that is producing the Gospel of John, they've separated from their former co-religionists, and so the Jews are becoming a different group. So Jesus says, your ancestor Abraham rejoiced that he would see my day. He saw it and was glad. Then the Jews said to him, you are not yet 50 years old, and have you seen Abraham? Jesus said to them, very truly I tell you, before Abraham was, I am. So again, he's equating himself here with the Logos, God's Word. He's saying before Abraham existed as a mortal human being on earth, I am. So he's God. So they picked up stones to throw at him. That's the traditional punishment for blasphemy. But we read that Jesus hid himself and went out of the temple. So the next major event in Mark is the anointing of Jesus' feet. So a woman uses expensive funerary ointment at Bethany 2 days before the Passover feast, at least in Mark's chronology. And Matthew also follows Mark's source closely, so we'll read this from Matthew chapter 26. While Jesus was in Bethany, that town that's just a little bit to the little village that's just to the east of Jerusalem, in the home of Simon the leper, a woman came to him with an alabaster jar of a very expensive perfume, which she poured on his head as he was reclining at the table. When the disciples saw this, they were indignant. "Why this waste?" they asked. "This perfume could have been sold at a high price and the money given to the poor." Aware of this, Jesus said to them, "Why are you bothering this woman? She has done a beautiful thing to me. The poor you will always have with you, but you will not always have me. When she poured this perfume on my body, she did it to prepare me for burial." So this is a funerary perfume. This woman is actually symbolically showing that we're at the last week here of Jesus' life. And so even though it's an expensive and valuable thing, there was an important reason to make this statement. So in both Mark and Matthew, just as we read the Matthew account here, the setting is the home of somebody called Simon the leper, who doesn't otherwise appear in the text. And this woman who does this is entirely anonymous. She is not described as a sinner or a prostitute. That doesn't exist in Mark's original account here or in Matthew's account. And further, the people complaining about the waste of the perfume are, the disciples in general, anonymous disciples who are objecting to the waste. Luke tells a different version of the story. Luke, in fact, has chosen to remove the story from the Passion narrative, so it is not taking place a couple days before the Passover. Luke places it much, much earlier, and then gives it an entirely different setting, message, and meaning. Luke sets the story not in Bethany in the home of the Simon the leper, but an anonymous rich Pharisee. And Luke makes this anonymous woman into a sinner. So presumably Luke means a prostitute here. So that's where we get that idea that the woman anointing Jesus' feet is a prostitute. And rather than prefiguring Jesus' death, Luke uses the story to contrast the relative inhospitality of this rich religious authority. Here's a person who should have really understood and welcomed Jesus, but the person who really understands Jesus is actually a woman who is on the margin of a society, somebody that society sees as a sinner. And Luke here makes a big deal that the woman is also washing Jesus' feet with her tears. So it's no longer this prefiguring of Jesus' death. Rather, this is about Jesus' ministry, why he's received not by the rich and powerful, the religious authorities of his day, but instead is received by women, people who are seen as unclean or sinners, people who are at the margins of society. These are the people who are being called into the new Christian community in Luke's version of the story. Finally, we have John's version of the story. This keeps it in its original Passion setting. It's set still in Bethany, but this time it's placed at the house of Mary and Martha, and it's actually takes place before Palm Sunday. So this, in John's Gospel, before we have that Jesus getting on the colt of the donkey and riding into Jerusalem, this takes place earlier in John's version, in John's chronology. So Mary and Martha are famous because they are sisters in Luke's Gospel who represent two very different archetypes of discipleship. So Martha is getting the house ready, making sure that everything is set for the hospitality, whereas Mary is simply basking in Jesus' presence and is listening to Jesus share ideas. And Martha wants Jesus to tell Mary to cut it out and help her do the grunt work of keeping things in order, and Jesus says that Mary has chosen the better part. And so this is, like I say, an archetype that church members read, and they tend to always are sympathetic with Martha, because we all have to keep the church clean and that kind of thing. But in any event, those are archetypes that are only in Luke's gospel. In John's gospel, Mary and Martha are identified as sisters of Lazarus, the guy who is Jesus's very close friend, who he's raised from the dead. Again, like I said, that only exists in John's gospel. And in this story, it's Mary of Bethany who replaces the anonymous woman anointing Jesus' feet. So we read in the Gospel of John chapter 12, 6 days before the Passover, so it's earlier, it's not 2 days as in Mark, 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany, to the home of Lazarus, whom he had raised from the dead. There they gave a dinner for him. Martha served, and Lazarus was one of those reclining with him. Mary took a pound of costly perfume made of pure nard, anointed Jesus' feet, and wiped them with her hair. The house was filled with the fragrance of perfume. But Judas Iscariot, one of the disciples, the one who was about to betray him, said, "Why was this perfume not sold for 300 denarii and the money given to the poor?" He said this not because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. He kept the common purse that all the disciples had, and he used to steal what was put into it. Jesus said, "Leave her alone. She bought it so that she might keep it for the day of my burial. You always have the poor with you, but you do not always have me." So I read that whole thing out because you can kind of see how similar it was to the Matthew story, but there's a bunch of very interesting differences. So, for example, it's in this Gospel of John that Judas Iscariot is given the role of objecting. And so, as opposed to, and again, it's also one of the ideas that, again, in John, it's part of the Passion story because it's prefiguring that Jesus is going to die. So even though Luke moved the story away from the Passion and away from Bethany, and Luke changed the anonymous woman into a sinner, sort of bizarrely, this is the single source of the misidentification of Mary Magdalene as a prostitute. So Mary Magdalene is one of the most important female disciples of Jesus. She's not in any version of this story, but at a certain point, people start conflating everybody. And so Pope Gregory I conflated Mary of Bethany with Mary Magdalene with the woman who's a sinner, and thus started describing Mary Magdalene as a reformed prostitute. But this is just from a misreading of the Gospels by conflating them all together and mistaking different characters for different people. There's really no connection, the sinful woman to Mary Magdalene. All right, the next component of the Passion story, he's already debuted here in John's Gospel, is Judas Iscariot, Jesus' betrayer. So as we've seen all the way back when we were looking at Paul writing within a couple decades of Jesus' execution, is already aware of the tradition that Jesus has handed over. And all four of the Gospels identify the betrayer as a character known as Judas Iscariot, one of the 12, one of the disciples. But the motivations that they give him and the details of how it happened differ. So Mark doesn't actually give a motivation for Judas. We read in Mark 14, "Then Judas Iscariot, who was one of the 12, went to the chief priests in order to betray him to them," to betray Jesus to the chief priests. "When the priests heard it, they were greatly pleased and promised to give him money. So he began to look for an opportunity to betray him." So there's money involved, but he didn't say he's going to come to them to betray him for money. They're happy that he's going to betray him, and they offer money after. Matthew makes the motivation mercenary from the start. So Judas goes to the chief priests in Matthew's account and says, "What are you willing to give me if I deliver him to you? If I give him over, what are you going to give me?" And Matthew alone makes the amount of the money 30 pieces of silver. And he clearly does this in order to reference another verse in Zechariah, where the speaker in Zechariah chapter 11, verse 13 says, "I took 30 shekels of silver and I threw them into the treasury in the house of the Lord." So by having Judas be paid 30 pieces of silver, Matthew is then later in his story able to fulfill Zechariah's verse. It's not really a prophecy, but anyway, this verse that he's echoing. So after Judas betrays Jesus and he feels terrible, he runs back to the chief priests and he says, "I've sinned, for I have betrayed innocent blood." The priests say, "Well, what is that to us? That's none of our business." And so then Judas takes the 30 pieces of silver and he throws the money into the temple, and then he goes and hangs himself. One of the two contradictory ways that the evangelists create an end to Jesus. An end to Judas. So he hangs himself after throwing away the pieces of silver in Matthew's account. In Acts, which is the second part of Luke's account, he takes the money, he buys a field, and he trips and falls over and kills himself in the field. So two different versions. But Matthew's one, you can see where it comes from, which is this phrase in Zechariah. So again, because all of the evangelists, all early Christians, believed that Jesus lived according to the Scriptures. Anytime they didn't have a detail of how his life was lived, they could go back to the Scriptures, they could go to the Septuagint, they could find a verse, and they could see, oh, well, that must have happened because Jesus lived according to the Scriptures, and they were able to incorporate that into the narrative that they were creating. So, by contrast, Luke and John give Jesus a more cosmic motivation. It's Satan, it's the devil that is entering into Judas. And this is kind of a rare Lucan Johannine agreement. Usually Luke and John aren't agreeing as much. So in Luke 22 we read, "Then Satan entered into Judas called Iscariot, who was one of the 12. He went away and conferred with the chief priests and officers of the temple about how he might betray them." So it's not money for Judas and Luke, it's about Satan's control over Judas. Similarly, in John chapter 13, we read that the devil had already decided that Judas, son of Simon Iscariot, would betray Jesus. So in John, Judas does not even go to meet with the priests to plot, much less get paid off by them. He's decided that he's going to betray them. But he doesn't have a meeting ahead of time. So the next event of the Passion is the Last Supper, the next major scene in Mark. So we've already seen in Paul that this tradition was known to be associated with the end of Jesus' life, as Paul wrote to the Corinthians decades earlier than Mark was composed. In the Synoptics, in Mark, Matthew, and Luke, the meal that we call the Last Supper takes place, quote, on the first day of the unleavened bread, when the Passover lamb is sacrificed. So that's the day when the Passover lamb is sacrificed. It's explicitly a Passover meal. But in John, it takes place on a different day. So the meal takes place just before the feast of the Passover, because Jesus will himself be put to death on the afternoon of the Passover when the lambs are slaughtered. So they're not eating the Passover meal when the lamb is already prepared, because it's more important to the author of John to have Jesus slain on the same moment that the Passover lambs are. So, that the Gospel of John wants to really equate Jesus as the sacrificial lamb, and in other places portrays Jesus as the Lamb of God, and that is also in the Johannine text of the Apocalypse of John, not written by the same author, but sharing themes, Johannine themes, where Jesus is the Lamb of God who is sacrificed. So, like I say, the Gospels are theological books. They're not histories or biographies. These two details can't be, there's lots of mental gymnastics that go into how you square them. The Gospels are saying, giving two different days for when Jesus' crucifixion happens. One is on the day of the Passover itself, and one of the others are saying, no, it's happening after that. So, and people have tried to work that out, but it's just that they conflict because it's more important to the author of John, not historicity, but rather to directly equate Jesus as the sacrificial lamb than it was to present the Last Supper as a Passover meal. Next in John, anyway, is also only in John. So during this meal that they're having, Jesus has a spiritual practice where he washes the feet of all of the disciples. This is, on the one hand, is following after what Mary of Bethany had done in the preceding chapter, since she had anointed Jesus' feet, but now he's washing the feet of the disciples to show again this kind of hospitality, but it's also embodying servanthood ministry. So Jesus is kingdom, which is not of this world, is also not a hierarchy where there is some kind of an absolute leader that we're all slaves to in this very negative sense, but rather as being servants, we are served by the leadership. And this is a demonstration of a spiritual practice that is probably practiced in the Johannine spiritual community or early Christian community. And it's a spiritual practice that some Christians often do. The popes, for example, regularly do this, but other Christian sects do as well. So the next phase after this in all of the Gospels is that Jesus predicts that he will be betrayed. So this is after the preparations for the Passover meal in the Synoptics, after the washing of the disciples' feet in John. So we read in Mark, when they had taken their places and were eating the Passover meal, Jesus said, "Truly I tell you, one of you will betray me, one who is eating with me." And they began to be distressed and to say to him one after another, "Surely not I." And he said to them, "It is one of the 12, one who is dipping bread into the bowl with me. For the Son of Man goes as it is written of him, but woe to the one by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been better for that one not to have been born." So Jesus says that one of the 12 is betraying him, one of the people at the table, but he doesn't say which one in Mark. And Luke has Jesus make a similarly general prediction like that so that none of them can tell who he means. But Matthew makes the identity of the betrayer much more clear. So we had in Mark all the people saying, you don't mean me, you don't mean me. But in Matthew, it's Judas who says that. Judas, the one who would betray him, said, "Surely you don't mean me, Rabbi." Jesus answered, "You have said so." So that should make it fairly clear to everybody in the Matthewan version. The general prediction in John causes that same confusion. And so when that happens, Peter motions to one of the major characters in the Gospel of John, a character that exists only in John, who is anonymous, it's unnamed, but is always identified as that other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved. And so that other disciple, the beloved disciple, was, quote, reclining close to Jesus's heart. And so Peter wants him to find out, who does Jesus mean? Who is going to betray him? So while reclining next to Jesus, this anonymous beloved disciple asks him, "Lord, who is it?" Jesus answered, "It is the one whom I give this piece of bread when I have dipped it in the dish." So it's the same thing that is in all the others, but it's all reworked a little differently here. So when he had dipped the piece of bread, he gave it to Judas, son of Simon Iscariot. After Judas received the piece of bread, Satan entered into him. Jesus said to him, "Do quickly what you are going to do." So they're all sitting there watching it, but they don't understand what's going on. So no one knew why Jesus said that to Judas. Some of them thought because Judas had the common purse, Jesus was telling him, buy what we need for the festival, or that he should go give something to the poor, whatever, do something that he needed. So it's after receiving the piece of bread, Judas immediately went out, and it was night. So as with Matthew, we have Jesus kind of specifically identifying Judas as the traitor in the Gospel of John, but the real reason why no one understood what he meant at the time is maybe made a little more clear in the Gospel of John. So immediately after this, in the Synoptics, Jesus institutes the Lord's Supper using a formula similar to the one that Paul recorded. So I read this before at the beginning of the lecture about Jesus breaking the bread, giving thanks, and so on. The Markan version is very similar. So he said, we read in Mark, Jesus took a loaf of bread, and after blessing it, broke it, and gave it to them, and said, "Take, this is my body." And then he took a cup, and after giving thanks, he gave it to them, and all of them drank from it. And he said to them, "This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many." So Matthew has a formula that follows Mark, but adds, after it says, "This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many," he adds into that, "for the forgiveness of sins." So this is another understanding of the meaning of it in the Matthean community. So Luke's formula doesn't mention forgiveness of sins, but adds kind of complexity. So first, Jesus shares the cup, then shares the bread, and then there's sharing of the cup again. So maybe in the Lucan community, there's somewhat different understanding of the tradition has developed. So the authors of John are certainly aware of the Christian practice of sharing the Lord's Supper, but no similar formula is mentioned in the Gospel of John here. We know that the Johannine community understands about this practice that has become communion or the sacrament of the Lord's Supper, because there's a place earlier in John chapter 6 where Jesus is teaching a group of Jews, and he's teaching them the "I am the bread of life" teaching, and he's comparing himself to manna, that is the bread that God gave the children of Israel as they're wandering in the wilderness. It's kind of a magic bread that comes from heaven. So in that chapter, Jesus says to them, "I am the bread of life. Your ancestors ate manna in the wilderness, and they died." So they're all dead now. No, it's not, they didn't die from the manna, but they died from old age and so forth in the meantime. So this is the bread that comes down from heaven, so that one may eat of it and not die. I am the living bread that came down from heaven. Whoever eats of this bread will live forever, and the bread that I will give for the life of the world is my flesh. Then the Jews disputed among themselves, saying, "How can this man give us his flesh to eat?" So Jesus said to them, "Very truly I tell you, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you will have no life in you." So again, this symbolic metaphor, this understanding of Jesus' body as the bread in the communion, the understanding of Jesus' blood as the wine in the communion, which is meant meaningfully, is nevertheless many, many times in the 1st and 2nd and 3rd centuries and up to this present, it gives Christians the reputation that it's meant literally, and that therefore Christians are thought to be cannibals, or their enemies say they're cannibals. And certainly when Pliny the Younger, who's the governor of Bethany, when he is kind of interrogating Christians, this is a rumor that he's trying to track down. But after he's tortured some deaconesses, he finds out, well, no, they're just eating normal, wholesome, good food. So there's no cannibalism going on. So it's a charge that comes from this idea. But in any event, this is something that we can see the people in the Johannine community, they do know about this practice of the blood and the body, the bread and the wine. Nevertheless, despite John's awareness of the practice, and also that long tradition of associating it with the Last Supper. So we had that, Paul said that all the way back, that this is something that Jesus did on the night he was handed over. Nevertheless, in the story of the Last Supper in the fourth Gospel, an institution of the Lord's Supper is absent unless that story I read a couple slides ago, where Jesus is breaking bread, dipping it in a bowl, and giving it to Judas, who then receives it from Jesus, unless that's meant to describe communion, which is a understanding that was very, I think, unsettling to some early Christians, if that was the intent of the author. And so some of the scribes, even in our manuscripts of John, so alternate traditions, they actually delete where it says that Judas received it, so they don't want it to look like Judas is receiving communion from Jesus, but that may be how it's meant. Can't know for sure. So John alone gives the Last Supper as the occasion when Jesus institutes a new commandment. So Jesus says, I command you that you love one another, just as I has loved you. You should also love one another, and by this everyone will know you're my disciples, if you have love for one another. And indeed, one of the reasons why, when I was saying that the Gospel of John devotes a lot more time to this last week, many more long teachings are included now within the Gospel of John than the much more fast-paced action that happens in the other Gospels. All four Gospels next have Jesus predicting that Peter will deny him, and they pretty much use the same words like the ones we'll read here in Luke 22. I tell you, Peter, the cock will not crow this day until you have denied me three times that you know me. Which is then followed by an ending of them being in the supper chamber where the Last Supper has happened, and now as they go to another location where Jesus is now going to pray in the nighttime. In Mark and Matthew, the action moves to a place called Gethsemane, where Jesus takes what the synoptics portray as his inner trio of disciples, Peter, James, and John. These are singled out several times in the Gospel of Mark and the other two Gospels that follow him. So he asks them to come and pray with him. And then as he prays, Jesus says, Abba, Father, for you all things are possible. Remove this cup from me. Yet not what I want, but what you want. So 3 times as he's praying, he comes back and he finds that the disciples have been unable to stay awake while praying with him. As opposed to Mark and Matthew, who names the spot as Gethsemane, Luke gives the location as the Mount of Olives. And in Luke's version, Jesus only catches the disciples sleeping one time at the very end of his prayer. But in an interesting component of the prayer, or the description of the prayer, as some manuscripts of Luke have it, there are these extra 2 verses. These were not in the original, but have become important imagery. So the interpolated verses added into the prayer in Luke say, Then an angel from heaven appeared to him, to Jesus, and gave him strength. In his anguish he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat became like great drops of blood falling down on the ground. In the Gospel of John, by contrast, this kind of location, this time, is used by the author, the evangelist, to insert a very long theological prayer that Jesus gives on behalf of his disciples. And it's only after that prayer that Jesus and the disciples go, quote, across the Kidron Valley to a place where there was a garden. And so we can kind of see here in this map of Jerusalem at the time of Jesus, the walled area. The valley immediately on the eastern wall is called the Kidron Valley. Then there's a mountain called the Mount of Olives. And there is a place, traditional site of Gethsemane, which all of these are conflated together because none of the accounts say the same thing. So Mark and Matthew call it Gethsemane, It's only John that calls it a garden. Luke is saying it's on the Mount of Olives. You put those all together, and now the traditional spot is a garden called Gethsemane at the base of the Mount of Olives. So all four Gospels tell similar stories of Jesus' arrest, but again, there's interesting differences. If we start with the earliest one in Mark, we read, Jesus says to the disciples who are with him, "The hour has come. The Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Get up, let us be going. Look, my betrayer is at hand." And immediately while he was speaking, Judas, one of the 12, arrived. And with him there was a crowd with swords and clubs from the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders. Now the betrayer had given them a sign saying, "The one I will kiss is the man. Arrest him and lead him away under guard." So when he, Judas, came, he went up to Jesus at once and said, "Rabbi," and kissed him. Then they, the guards, laid hands on him and arrested him. But one of those who stood near drew his sword and struck the slave of the high priest, cutting off his ear. So one of Jesus' disciples. Then Jesus said to them, "Have you come out with swords and clubs to arrest me as if I were a rebel? Day after day I was teaching in the temple, and you did not arrest me, but let the scriptures be fulfilled." And then all of the disciples deserted him and fled, and a certain young man was following him, wearing nothing but a linen cloth. They, the guards, caught a hold of him, but he left the linen cloth and ran off naked. So in all three synoptics, so that's the Mark version. In Matthew and Luke, Jesus also is betrayed by Judas with a kiss. That's a sign. And the disciple who cuts off the ear of the high priest's slave is anonymous, so we don't know who that is. The young man here is also anonymous, but that's not included in the other two stories. In Matthew's gospel, concerning the anonymous disciple with the sword, he says, "Put your sword back in its place," Jesus said to him, "for all those who draw the sword will die by the sword. So if you live by the sword, you'll die by the sword." It's only in Luke's version that we have Jesus healing the ear of the high priest's slave. Mark's version, like I said, kind of emphasizes this chaos of the disciples scattering, including this young man who flees without his linen cloth. Like I say, that's deleted by both Matthew and Luke. And Matthew doesn't really like to delete Mark and stuff, so he just found maybe the chaos unsettling. The chaos of the disciples all fleeing and abandoning Jesus is also lacking in John's version. The version in John alone identifies Peter as the disciple who cuts off the ear of the high priest's slave. And the Gospel of John also gives that slave a name. He's called Malchus, which means king. In John's version, though, Judas does not kiss Jesus. So that sign is not present. Instead, when Judas approaches along with a group that includes chief priests and Pharisees, but also temple police and soldiers, Jesus is the one who calls out to them. So we read in John 18, "Then Jesus, knowing all that was to happen to him, came forward and asked them, 'Whom are you looking for?' They answered, 'Jesus of Nazareth.' Jesus replied, 'I am he.'" So it's another one of these "I am" statements. So here again, Jesus is equating himself with Yahweh. He's declaring, "I am." And this becomes revelatory to Judas, who realizes Jesus' divinity in this moment. Judas, then we read, who betrayed him, was standing with them. When Jesus said to him, "I am he," they stepped back and fell to the ground. So in contrast to just the account that we just read in Mark, it's always in this portrayal in John's gospel, Jesus in the garden here, he's fully aware of everything that is going to happen. He is always in command of the situation. As he gives himself over freely to the guards and soldiers here, he says to Peter, "Sheathe your sword. Am I not to drink the cup the Father has given me?" So he knows that this is the destiny that he has to do. In all four Gospels, then, Jesus is next taken before Jewish officials to be investigated. Matthew and John give the high priest's name as Caiaphas, although John says that the initial trial is at the home of Caiaphas' father-in-law, Annas. Meanwhile, Luke and Mark leave the high priest unnamed. There's just difference of those kinds of details throughout. In John's gospel, Peter is joined by this important character in John's gospel, the other disciple, the disciple whom Jesus loved. It turns out that disciple has some kind of personal connection with Caiaphas, and thus he is able to get Peter into the courtyard. That's the explanation of why Peter is in there. And then once he's in the courtyard, different people ask him if he's one of Jesus' disciples. And this begins in John's version with a woman who guarded the gate. It's always a woman, because in Mark and Luke, it's called a female servant of the priest, and in Matthew, it's called a servant girl of the priest. So some woman who's a servant or employee of some kind of the high priest starts it off, and it gets from there, Peter denies him 3 times, or denies knowing Jesus 3 times. And when we hear that at the end, immediately a rooster crowed. So fairly similar story of Peter's denial in all 4 Gospels. In Mark and Matthew, in terms of the charges before the Jewish authorities, witnesses try to say that Jesus has threatened to destroy the temple. So they quote as saying that if you take this temple and I will destroy it. I mean, if it'll. He looked at the temple and using that as a visual. He's saying, take this temple and after 3 days, if it is destroyed, I will raise it up again. And so the idea, though, is that that's a metaphorical teaching. In other words, Jesus, if he is killed, he'll be resurrected on the 3rd day. And so because the witnesses don't agree, they're not able to use that charge. But then in all 3 of the synoptics, Jewish authorities ask Jesus whether he is the Messiah. Are you the Son of God? Are you the Messiah? And sort of surprisingly, in Mark, Jesus says, I am. It's not a statement that he's normally making. It may not be as charged as the way it's said in the Gospel of John, but he is coming out and admitting it, which is unusual because there's been this messianic secret, as Jesus is telling people not to say anything about it. Now he's going to tell about it. So he says, I am, and then he quotes Daniel. So there is a very important messianic prophecy in the book of Daniel, where it says, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power, coming in the clouds of heaven. And so Jesus is saying he is the not just the Son of Man the way it's sometimes used in the Gospels. He is actually the cosmic Son of Man figure, that is to say, a divine Messiah. And that all by itself is enough to establish a charge of blasphemy for the Jewish authorities here in Mark. In Matthew and Luke, Jesus is a little more circumspect. So in Matthew, when the priest asks Jesus, are you the Messiah? Are you the Son of God? Jesus replies, you have said so. So he doesn't confirm it the way he does in Mark. And when he's asked whether he is the Son of God in Luke, Jesus replies, again, you say that I am, not I am. You say that I am. Nevertheless, in both Matthew and Luke, Jesus does go on to quote Daniel, which is to say that he claims that he is the cosmic Son of Man figure, which really is the same as announcing that he is the Messiah. And so in all 3 cases, Jewish authorities have the testimony they need to be convinced themselves that Jesus here is being blasphemous, that he and his sect, the Christians, are all heretics as far as they're concerned. And so they next have to send Jesus to Pilate. What's sort of surprising, maybe most surprising of all to me, is that John is where Jesus is the most coy. So he was very forthright and explicit about that he's the Messiah in Mark, where he had this messianic secret all this time, and he pretty much confirms everything in Matthew and Luke. Now in John, where Jesus from the very start of this book has been openly speaking of his divinity, now he refuses to say anything to the high priest. So the high priest questioned Jesus about his disciples and about his teaching. Jesus answered, I have spoken openly to the world. I have always taught in synagogues and in the temple, where all the Jews came together. I have said nothing in secret. Why do you ask me? Ask those who have heard what I said to them. They know what I said. So he doesn't implicate himself to the high priest. Nevertheless, in the same way, he set off to Pilate for trial in John as well as the other three. And so now, in his trial before the Roman authorities, in his trial before Pontius Pilate, previously the religious authorities are worried about, is he blasphemous? Are he and these people in his movement, what's now now become Christians as the Gospels are written in the time frame of the Gospels, are they all heretics? That doesn't work for the civil authorities, and so the charge that is brought to Pontius Pilate is insurrection. In all four Gospels, Pilate asks Jesus, "Are you the King of the Jews?" To which Jesus answers in Mark and Luke, "You say so." That same kind of response that he's giving to the priests in Matthew and Luke. Or, "You have said so," in Matthew. Or, again, in John, we now have that same kind of thing. "You say that I am a king." So by the time the Gospels are being written, Christian tradition has increasingly begun to exonerate Pilate in ways that have now been worked into the Gospel tradition. So Pilate was it was under his authority that the historical Jesus is executed, but as Christianity has separated now by the end of the first century from Judaism and is less a sect of Judaism and is now emerging after the schism as its own religion in its own right, and it is working to live under Roman rule, that is, not to face persecutions like happened under Nero, locally anyway, in Rome. The Christians are wanting to present themselves as, no, we are not trying to overthrow Roman rule. Our religion is compatible with Roman rule, and so on. And so Pilate has begun a long tradition of being rehabilitated already by the time the Gospels are written. So all four Gospels have Pilate offer the crowd who have gathered for the festival the opportunity to have Jesus pardoned. And so they state that there's this tradition. It's not known outside of the Gospels, but in any event, the Gospels state there is a tradition where on the Passover, the Roman prefect will pardon and release a criminal. And so Pilate gives them the choice. You can either take this convicted insurrectionist called Barabbas, or you can have Jesus. And the crowd, in all four cases, wants to release Barabbas. In the Gospel of Matthew alone, the detail is added that Pilate doesn't want any part of this. He publicly washes his hands of responsibility in front of the crowd. And then the crowd chants back, take the responsibility on us and on our children, which is, again, an idea that Matthew has added for his own purposes as an evangelist. He's trying to, it is not something that the crowd would have said at the historical Jesus time, if any of this has any historicity to it. But in any event, unfortunately, it has had consequences where it's fueled anti-Semitism in Christianity historically. In any event, no matter how much Pilate, as described in the gospel accounts, would like to avoid this decision, as much as the gospel writers want to exonerate him, nevertheless, the crowds are intent. They all yell, "Crucify him," which Pilate then has the ultimate authority of doing, and he orders done. And so that leads us all the way up through the trials. And so when we get into part 2 of this, which we're going to do next week, we're going to look at the differing accounts of the execution of Jesus, and then the differing accounts of the Easter story of the resurrection of Jesus. And so that will be our lecture for next week. which will do Contradictions in the Easter stories, beginning with the actually Good Friday story and then the Easter story. All right, so I am going to get a glass of water while Leandro gathers your questions. I want to begin by thanking people for the support they've already given during the lecture here. So JM, thank you. Fire Ever Living, thank you so much. Captain Sunshine, SM, and also Anders and Alistair, thank you so much.
You have to read what, oh yeah.
I haven't gotten there yet. I also want to thank Zorak, 1997, who, oh wow, thank you so much, Zorak. Zorak says, here is $1 for every upvote gained in the first hour. Well owned, and I hope you keep them coming. Get yourself a nice necktie. Okay, well, very good. Thank you, Zorak. I really appreciate that. And also, I appreciate, I wasn't, obviously, Leandro was watching the chat, so I'm just lecturing on and lecturing away, but it's always fun to hear that that people have been helping out, like you've been helping out, encouraging people to do likes and shares, and so I appreciate that so much. Costa Rica Sloth, thank you for your support. Costa Rica Sloth says, if crucifixion is central to Christianity, why didn't Paul or Mark focus on it? If Jesus was executed instead of being crucified, would this change Christianity? If so, how? Well, so Jesus is executed by crucifixion. So crucifixion is the means by which Jesus is executed. If you mean if Jesus was killed some other way, what would it change Christianity? So I guess I would say that one of the ways it matters that it's a crucifixion is that this is the Roman response to a perceived insurrection. And so that works very well theologically and thematically for Christianity, because Jesus, in presenting, teaching about a kingdom of God, a kingdom of heaven, the word kingdom in the Greek there is the same word in Greek that is used when the Greeks are talking about the Roman Empire. The Romans don't call their empire a kingdom, but it would be the kingdom of the Romans, the Roman kingdom. And so the idea theologically, I think, is that the Roman Empire is all about power, dominion, hierarchy, where where slaves are ultimately the basis of everything, and they have no rights and are completely mistreated. Whereas Jesus' kingdom turns that upside down, and as we saw in this story, Jesus himself, despite being God himself, exhibits servanthood ministry. So he himself washes the feet of the other disciples, who in turn are to serve others. And so execution by crucifixion puts Jesus directly in opposition to the forces of worldly empire. So he has a spiritual empire that turns worldly empire upside down. So if he were executed a different way, so if he were executed by stoning, let's say, then that would be a direct confrontation with, that's a tradition of heresy, how you kill heretics and others, people like that within Judaism. And so that would be a much more direct confrontation with Jewish authorities, and so it would make the religion more antagonistic. So even though there have been very terrible episodes of anti-Semitism and Christians having pogroms and killing Jews all the way up leading up to the Holocaust, the religions are not universally incompatible. There have actually been, the rules were against that. The church has, when it's operating properly, has taught that there should be tolerance, and Christians and Jews should be getting along as both worshiping the same God. So I think it's good that it's not a direct confrontation between Christians as a schism that have a completely different authority structure than Jews, and they're fighting each other that way, which might be embodied if Jesus had been executed by stoning. That's just kind of a speculation on that. So Anthony Freeman, your first super chat, thank you so much for your support. Let's see, some other questions. Ricky Palacios says, how does the Passion account in John 1 and John 2 factor into the canonical Gospels? Does the author of the book of John use these epistles, the epistles of John, Church and Epistle of John, as sources? So there's definitely from the same tradition. So I was going to go through, this lecture already got fairly long, so I was going to go through and look at, let's say, the rest of the different iterations of the Passion story as they exist in the other parts of the Bible. So there are also lots of formulations actually in the book of Acts. When Peter will go and give a sermon, or Paul will go and give a sermon, that will actually give kind of the sermon will often include kind of like a version of the Passion story in some cases, which might actually, they're not historical probably to Peter or Paul, but they may include like an early Christian formulation. So the same thing we can have pulling out, like you say, of the epistles of John, which are sharing lots of the same themes and ideas as the Gospel of John. They're coming from the same community. But I didn't go through and look at it. And so that would be really interesting for if we maybe did a part 4 of this, although it won't be Easter anymore. So maybe we'll do it next year, Easter. We'll look at how the Passion story is expressed in the epistles, the book of Acts, and also the book of Revelation. Kelly Higgins, thank you so much for your support. You have a future lecture idea, the ethics of Jesus. I like that. That's a really great idea. So we will have Leandro write that down for me, and we'll do that. Okay. Questions. So Zorak 1997 says, is it possible when Paul or Mark wrote they were unsure of the death date and chose the Passover to align Jesus with Moses and further posit his unexpected execution as a blood lamb sacrifice? Yes, I think it is possible. So, so part of the issue, we have, like I say, with, Paul, I think, doesn't actually say that it was on the Passover. He says on the night that he's handed over. So Mark says it's on the Passover, and John moves it to a couple days before the Passover. So, so to your point, it may well be, so how did they pick those dates? So maybe there is a tradition, maybe it historically did happen on the Passover. It would be a reason why Jesus and the apostles would go into town. It would be a reason why Pilate would be there, and along with other authorities. Pilate otherwise would be probably hanging out in Caesarea. So it doesn't not make sense. I mean, as a setting, it does make sense, but it also, we can't know for sure that that's the date that it happened. Are we going to thank some other supporters? Is that what you're thinking, Leandro? So let me thank some other supporters who have been donating. Thank you so much to Colin Kerr, to Galen DaCosta, to Diana Patterson, to Nancy Barnett, Alan Young, Melinda Craig, Charles Reynolds, Michael Stearman, Gregory Lund, Frederick Patton, Clifton Stuckey, Susan Gregory, Scott Heine, Stephen Slayback, Eric Nordquist, John Klinker, the American Legacy Construction, Jason Bishop, Neil DeAtley, Stephen Hack, Ron Wagner, and the Ken Rector Foundation. Thanks so much for all of the contributions that you've been making on PayPal and other ways and other means. We really appreciate that. Winston Barquez also asks about the date of the Last Supper. Why would the synoptic Jesus eat a Passover meal while the Johannine Jesus would eat an ordinary Last Supper meal? So in the case of the synoptics, what's possibly being done here is what we've already seen happen elsewhere. So in some ways, Christianity, which is coming out of Jewish roots, and is nevertheless fully ensconced in its context as a Jewish sect. So in the same way that John the Baptist is taking an existing Jewish practice of mikveh bathing, of purity, washing for purity ritual, and he's changing that into a fully spiritualized practice of baptism for remission of sins. He's not taking that out of nowhere. He's taking an existing spiritual practice that has meaning within the community, and he's repurposing it to something else. So in the same way, the possibility is that, okay, here you take this particular meal, Passover meal that already has all of these understandings, and now we're repurposing this as a new kind of sacred meal that is going to be important in the Christian community, the sacrament of the Lord's Supper, communion, or Eucharist. And so that could be the understanding of the placement of this for Mark and Matthew and Luke. And it also could just be that there's a tradition that that this is when it actually happened. So that could be part of just a historical memory that is part of that community that has placed it at that time. And then why would the Johannine Jesus eat an ordinary meal instead of the Passover meal? It's because it's so important to the Johannine community to equate Jesus' death with the death of the sacrificial lambs. This is the end of blood sacrifice. The new covenant has Jesus having made a one eternal covenant as the Lamb of God. Jesus conquers not in the expected way. In the book of Revelation, which is another Johannine book, John looks and he sees and he thinks that there's this lion that's going to conquer the Messiah that he's been expecting, the Lion of Judah. And then when he sees who actually is there in this place, he actually sees a lamb, and it's a lamb that has been sacrificed, but he conquers in being a sacrifice. And so this is central imagery to the Johannine community, and so it's more important to them to place symbolically and meaningfully to place Jesus' crucifixion at that moment of when the Passover lambs are sacrificed. Julie Bezuski says, the charge of blasphemy has always confused me. Someone had to be the Messiah, and later Bar Kokhba claimed to be him. Why wasn't that blasphemy? It's not blasphemy when Bar Kokhba does it because the rabbis agreed with him. So it would have been blasphemy to some of the rabbis. Some of the rabbis would have said, there's no way this guy's the Messiah. But we know that some of the rabbis did agree, and that's one of the reasons why he had legitimacy from the religious authorities, or some of the religious authorities. For the ones who wouldn't have agreed, it's blasphemy to them. So the way, the way blasphemy works is it's usually, and heresy works is, one group's orthodoxy is another group's heresy, and so it is a little bit relative. So things that are viewed in Latin Catholicism now, as doctrine, some other things, let's say that the Jehovah's Witnesses teach about Jesus, are considered heretical because that's the perspective of the one group against the other group, and the Jehovah's Witnesses think that they have the only truth, and so on. That's why because they also don't have control over it, they can't just kill him for blasphemy, presumably. It's not entirely sure, but that's how the Gospels portray it. They need to have a civic charge in order to get Pilate to kill him anyway. Fire Ever Living. How did early Christian scholars like Augustine understand these contradictions? So early Christian scholars tended to prefer to set the table for where they could for harmonizing. And so when I've talked about how Christians have inherited this idea of harmonizing and where they read all the things together, that's how early Christians tended to like to understand it. So they're living in a time before they had the academic discipline of history where they were able to weigh the sources and understand them and decide which one, reading them for their biases and deciding based on the evidence that we have what is likely to be the case and what is not. They weren't looking at it that way at all. Augustine is looking at it as these are all sources of authority. They're saying different and contradictory things. So how can we explain that and retain them all? And so if there's a terrible contradiction, they might explain that one of the texts must be an error. But they will try to get away from not doing that if they can at all. So they would rather try to harmonize it, if at all humanly possible. And that has been a long-standing tradition, which lots of Christians do to this day, but it's not a historically accurate or grounded tradition. So it's academically false tradition of way of doing it. You're not doing it based on history anymore. It's based on a complete truth claim that denies history. Related to this, Iman Padama says, wasn't Josephus a historian in the modern sense? No. So Josephus is a historian in the ancient sense, which is different from a historian in, it's different from, let's say, a gospel writer like Mark. So Mark has an agenda which is a religious agenda, and it's primarily, sort of twofold. It's trying to have people who read the gospel come to a testimony where they say at the end of it, Jesus is the Messiah. Jesus is constantly asking the disciples and therefore the readers, who do you say that I am? And you want to be screaming out, you are the Messiah, you're the, and that sort of thing. And the author of Mark is also an apocalypticist who believes the world is going to end in his lifetime, and so he wants you to be convinced of that. So that's a religious purpose as opposed to a historical purpose. Josephus is understanding the ancient pursuit of history that he's trained in, that is founded by the first great historians in Greek history, which are Herodotus and Thucydides. And so Herodotus and Thucydides, primarily their operation is to do things like you take sources and try to demythologize them. So they'll take something that we can tell is just a creation myth, and they will want to take that story and take it as a report and take the magic elements out of it so that they can cite, Zeus was actually this guy, or whatever they were going to say to Hercules was actually like this, and they take the mythological elements out in order to rationalize it as something that might have happened. They are not able to have, though, all of the different tools that are open to us. They certainly don't have archaeology. They don't have an extensive historical record that they can work with. They just simply haven't developed the modern academic discipline of history. So they're trying to write history. It is a goal, but they have other agendas also, even than trying to find what actually happened. Josephus is also a propagandist, and he has especially a bunch of different agenda items, not the least of which is making himself valuable to his patrons, the Roman emperors, but also in order to try to tell the Romans that Jewish people their religion is very ancient, but also totally compatible with the Roman Empire. Despite the fact that there's been these wars and rebellions, we should all be able to get along and that kind of a thing. And so as modern historians, we have to read people like Josephus for all of their particular biases so that we can try to reconstruct what actually happened using accounts that are flawed. Vincent Button, thank you so much for your support. Britta Visser Stump says, what is your favorite account of the Passion? I don't know. I was just reading them all. They're all interesting and in their own ways. So I've had, we've been in my church this year. We have been having a whole Easter series where we're doing this whole year, we're doing the Gospel of John. And so I've been exploring the Gospel of John and enjoying it, a lot, which wasn't true originally. Originally, way back when I started studying the Gospels for the first time, I started with the Gospel of John because it has the same name as me. And I really didn't like it at all because it is so far removed from the historical Jesus or anything related to like anything that could have actually happened. Instead, it's a very theological book. But I'm enjoying that a lot more than I originally would. So right now, that appeals to me. In the past, I almost always like the ideas of Luke the best, and so I usually end up liking Luke's accounts of things. But then I like Mark because of it being more raw and early, and so I guess I don't know the order I would even say on that. Right now I'm leaning towards John, so that's like the favorite this year. But probably normally it would be Luke. Kaiwan says, were the Romans as concerned about John the Baptist as they were about Jesus? Not according to, well, it depends on what you mean by Romans. So not according to Josephus. So according to Josephus, John the Baptist was simply killed by Herod the Tetrarch. So he is a Roman authority, but he's a Jewish Roman authority. So again, he is in charge of a little part of the client kingdom, Galilee and the Perea, and that's the area that John is active in. And so he is the one that decides to execute him. So I think that because John is running around in the area that is under a Roman client subject, a tetrarch, it's the tetrarch who has to be worried about him, presumably because he is leading, again, a popular movement, and so he has him killed according to Josephus and also according to the Gospels. JC, thank you for your support. How common are passion story variants in the non-canonical Gospels, Acts, and the other writings? Will you also do an episode on them? So I'm going to bring up some of that in some of the non-canonical ones I'm going to bring up. So, for example, I wanted to introduce the Gospel of Peter, which is a gospel that we only have in fragments. It claims to be by Peter, but it's not. It's a pseudepigraphic gospel. But it might be an early one, and it might represent its own tradition, or it might be another witness to this lost passion source tradition, or it might be somebody who has had access to the 4 canonical Gospels, but doesn't actually have a book of them in front of them. And so we can't really tell, but it is another one that has some interesting variations that I'm going to bring in. So definitely we'll talk about that in the next weeks. But in terms of, I wanted to do Acts because there is a lot of difference in some of the ways the Passion story is explained in Acts. There's this idea that Jesus is hung on a tree, which is in some ways interpreted as a metaphor for crucifixion, and it's used because it's a particularly shameful death from the Torah, from Deuteronomy, But in one of the recounts, anyway, in Acts, I think one of the times Paul is essentially telling the Passion story in Acts. So it's not really Paul; it's the author of Luke Acts who's putting this in Paul's mouth, and they're specifically saying when they took him down from the tree, and so there are some variations that are pretty interesting that would have their own theological import to them. That'd be essentially referencing that idea from from Deuteronomy. We'll do we'll bring some of that up in the next week, but then maybe, like I said, when we're doing Acts and the epistles and Apocalypse, how they're viewing the Passion or how they're viewing Easter, maybe we'll do that for Easter of 2026. Donna Ford. If Judas is the designated bad guy, did he sacrifice himself so that Jesus could become the Christ, or was he designated by God to do what he did? So this again, Donna, is we have different accounts and different reasons, right? And so we saw in Matthew and in Luke and in John that it's Satan who decides this. So Satan decides to have Judas betray Jesus, and then Satan actually enters Judas to take control of him, to betray him. Whereas that isn't in Mark and Matthew, and indeed we have in Mark, after Jesus is talking about someone betraying him, he says, it will be better that he never had been born, the one who betrayed me. So that implies that that he's not designated, but it's just something that occurred, and that that Judas is going to have damned himself for it. So we have competing. We have maybe an idea in John that that Judas is being given full fellowship, maybe even, and maybe we'll, there in other verses that we didn't go through, that maybe he, like everybody, will be able to be redeemed too. So it's not entirely, I would say the evangelists have different perspectives, like you're asking, in that full range. So if he had to do it, is that actually a good thing? And certainly that he actually did it in order for the whole plan to take place. And that's certainly the position of one of the non-canonical gospels, the Gospel of Judas, which more or less says that he had to do this. It was important for him to do it, and so although everybody looks down on Judas, Jesus is actually thankful to him, and so he's in part of the Gnostic idea here is that he needed to do that. So Judas is not looked on by all Christians as a traitor, therefore, because it's essential for some people. So there's a complete spectrum of opinion. Crimson 90, thank you for your support. Any future videos on Mormonism? I don't have any in the works, but if you have topic ideas about things you'd like to do, there's always interesting things that we could talk about. So there's a bunch of interesting topics within that field, and I know a bunch about it, so it would be easy to do. Dartharama, as we see the Hebrew Bible evolve from people who believe in Sheol to a possible afterlife, how did early Christians reconcile placing Jesus as being there from the beginning? So we have through all the lectures that you've been watching, Dartharama, we have been able to look at the Bible, developmentally. So we can see that there has been a progression of ideas, but in antiquity, people didn't think that was the case. If there's any seeming to be any kind of progression in terms of an eternal idea, ancient people believe that's because there has been a period of forgetfulness. And so for them, there was an antediluvian period before, this golden age, before the flood, when everybody knew all this stuff. They knew about Jesus and afterlife and all of these things. And it's only because of, human decay and forgetfulness that they have forgotten all these things. And now that this knowledge has been restored to us in these latter days, now that Jesus has lived among us and so forth. So they wouldn't have this idea that we have, that there's progress in ideas. And so they have no problem reconciling placing Jesus as being present from the beginning, because they now have an idea of God's word as being eternal and having existed since before the creation of time. Now, this is a brand new idea that nobody had before, but they understand it as having always existed because it's an eternal idea. So that's how they can reconcile it. Anthony Freeman and Patty O'Reilly have questions that are similar. So let's see. Anthony says, since we cannot use the Passion narratives as reliable history, what metaphorical, analogous lesson can we glean from these stories? And Patty says, with so many contradictions, how could anybody believe this amazing, crazy story? So yeah, so the point of it is not, if you're worried about believing it, I mean, I'm presuming this is a question for understanding it religiously. And so in my church, every Sunday, Beyond the Walls, that we live stream on this channel, we are not worrying about historicity or literalism ever. What we are worried about is meaning. So what is the underlying meaning of stories like this? And so there are all kinds of meanings that we take from these kinds of stories. One of these is that so there is, when we are understanding the prism through which we understand God, we understand that there is a source of meaning and truth and eternity in the universe, but that is unknowable and unseeable, and so it is only through that source's logos, that source's glory, made manifest in creation, when we see the eternal goodness that is present among us, that we are then participating in part in with that. And so the sacred story of Jesus dwelling among disciples and actually undergoing all of the human suffering is a bridge through which we connect to this unknowable source that is nevertheless present and with us in our lives in the present today. And so that is one of the ways that we glean meaning from the stories. They also, the story, as we already read, involves the initiation of the ritual of communion where we have that as a spiritual practice, so that we can feel that we are part of the body of Christ and are living as one together in sacred community and being part of that eternal presence of God's logos in the world. So those would just be a couple examples, but that's the most important thing. Is when we're trying to make it history or literal, then that robs it of meaning. It's just something that happened, and then in case it didn't happen, or in a lot of cases, or didn't happen as written, then it's dead and gone and not meaningful. Instead, like I say, we're looking for meaning, that we can live in the present. All right, that's it. Very good. So upcoming, we're having, as you see on the slide here, next week, part 2, Contradictions in the Easter stories. So we're going to talk about the Good Friday and Easter story. So all of the additional suffering that Jesus has as he's carrying the cross, as his crucifixion, what they do with his body, and then the resurrection stories. And then the week after that, don't forget, Leandro's lecture, How Christ Differs from the Dying and Rising Gods. And as always, if you want to like and share this video, we appreciate all the likes that we got. And thanks so much.